So if we go back to February 2025, there was basically a collective panic attack in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley.
Absolutely total panic.
Right. Because for years there was this unshakable narrative in the tech world. It was basically treated like a law of physics, that when it came to artificial intelligence, the United States was just they were untouchable.
Yeah, the assumption was totally one-sided.
Exactly. You had this image of American tech giants operating in a league of their own. They were building these digital brains that nobody else could even comprehend, let alone actually rival.
Right, the whole American tech fortress idea.
Yeah, this impenetrable fortress. They had like billions in capital. They had a monopoly on global talent, the raw silicon, all of it. It was this really comforting story of a one-horse race. But then this model called DeepSeek R1 dropped out of China.
And that completely upended everything.
It really did.
Yeah.
Because it was just as smart as the absolute strongest, most sophisticated American models on complex reasoning. It matched them step for step. And the kicker, the real crazy part, is it was built for basically pennies on the dollar.
Which was the part that really terrified the industry, honestly.
Right. Suddenly, this trillion-dollar American AI fortress just didn't look like a fortress anymore. It looked like a giant target.
Yeah, that DeepSeek R1 moment, it really forced a total reassessment of everything the Western tech sector just took for granted. I mean, it triggered this massive global competitive repricing. It basically proved that open-style model innovation could just, well, bypass the traditional bottlenecks of massive capital expenditure. The geopolitical contest underneath all this technology had just been totally misunderstood by the public.
Because it wasn't just a marathon with one runner miles ahead.
Exactly. It was a neck-and-neck sprint. And the terrain is just so much more complex than anyone assumed.
And that complexity is exactly what we're getting into today. So welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack this incredibly dense, extensive May 2026 report titled The United States and China in the AI Race.
It's a massive document.
It really is, because we are not just talking about, who gets to build the smartest chatbot to summarize your meetings or write your emails. If that was the end game, the stakes would be super low.
Yeah, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Right. We are talking about a battle over the fundamental building blocks of the 21st century. We're talking about global supply chains for advanced semiconductors, the raw electrical power being sucked out of national grids, the flow of elite human talent across borders, and just the physical infrastructure of the global economy.
And to really understand the scope of that competition, you have to look at what the industry calls the stack.
Okay, let's break that down for the listener.
Sure. So the AI ecosystem is fundamentally multi-layered. Treating it as just one big monolith is, well, it's the first analytical mistake most people make.
Right. It's not just AI as one thing.
Exactly. At the very bottom, the foundation of this stack, you have hardware. So highly specialized semiconductors, the lithography machines that literally print them, and the vast power grids needed to run them.
The physical stuff.
Right. Then, moving one layer up, you find compute and cloud infrastructure. The physical data centers where these chips are actually linked together into supercomputers.
Okay, got it.
Then above that, you have the foundation models themselves, the algorithms actually processing the data. And finally, at the very top is the application layer. This is how the tech diffuses into the real world, into factories, hospitals, logistics, militaries.
Which is where normal people actually interact with it.
Exactly. And what this 2026 report reveals is that the U.S. and China are essentially playing two completely different games across these different layers of the stack.
And for you listening right now, whether you're an entrepreneur trying to figure out your software supply chain, a student picking a career, or just someone intensely curious about global power shifts, you need to understand the mechanics of this race.
It affects everyone.
It really does. This geopolitical tug-of-war is actively reshaping your digital world. It dictates the software you use, the devices you can buy, and the whole structure of the economy you participate in every day. So let's start at the very top of that stack, the headline numbers.
Right, the raw capital.
Yeah. As of early 2026, the report says the U.S. still holds the stronger overall position in frontier AI. But that lead is rapidly narrowing. And when you look at the raw money involved, it's I mean, it requires a minute to process.
The disparity is wild.
It's insane. In 2024, U.S. private AI investment hit $109.1 billion. By contrast, China's private investment in that same period was $9.3 billion.
Which is a massive gap.
We're talking nearly a 12-fold difference in private capital.
The sheer scale of that disparity is breathtaking.
Yeah.
And you know, for a while, it did translate directly into model production volume.
Right.
Like in 2025, U.S. institutions produced 59 notable frontier-level models. China produced 35. Furthermore, the U.S. maintains near-total dominance in the public cloud market, which is basically the distribution mechanism for these models.
AWS, Microsoft, Google, right.
Exactly. In late 2025, just those three American companies captured 63% of all global enterprise cloud infrastructure spending. Alphabet and Amazon are forecasting hundreds of billions in capital expenditure through 2026. Meta alone made a pledge of over $600 billion by 2028.
Okay, let's unpack this, because my immediate instinct when I hear $109 billion going up against $9 billion is to just, well, call the game.
It seems insurmountable.
Right? I look at those numbers and think, how can any nation compete with a financial avalanche like that? But the report suggests there's kind of an illusion baked into these massive U.S. figures.
There is, yeah.
So why does that private investment matter so much at the top of the stack, but not actually guarantee a total victory?
Well, the disparity is really revealing when you look at what that $109 billion is actually buying. It's not magic. It doesn't just summon AI into existence. That capital represents the extreme concentration of three specific things: capital itself, elite frontier talent, and raw compute. And they're all housed within the balance sheets of just a handful of globally scaled American tech firms.
It's all aggregated.
Precisely. The U.S. system is uniquely optimized for aggregation. It gathers the brightest minds, gives them virtually unlimited compute, and backs them with corporate treasuries that can just absorb astronomical R&D costs. It's designed to build the absolute largest, most parameter-heavy models possible.
Okay, let's pause on that term for a second because we hear it constantly. Parameter heavy.
Right.
If we think about parameters like the synaptic connections in a human brain, the more connections you have, the more nuanced and capable the brain is.
That's a great way to put it.
But building a digital brain with trillions of these connections takes an unbelievable amount of electricity and hardware.
Highly accurate. And that requirement for a massive hardware and power, that is exactly where the vulnerability in those huge U.S. numbers lies.
Because it's not sustainable.
Well, it's facing severe scrutiny, let's put it that way. When Meta pledges $600 billion, or Alphabet forecasts $180 billion in a single year, you have to look at the physical reality of that spending.
They aren't just buying software licenses.
Exactly. They're pouring millions of tons of concrete, laying thousands of miles of fiber optics, buying hundreds of thousands of individual NVIDIA GPUs that cost tens of thousands of dollars each. They're building entire electrical substations just for one data center campus.
Wow.
So the fundamental question becomes, what happens if the monetization of these generative AI models doesn't match the staggering cost of the physical infrastructure?
Right. It's like building a state-of-the-art trillion-dollar 12-lane highway across the country before you even know if the average consumer owns a car or if they'll even pay the toll.
That's exactly the risk. Generative AI is incredibly expensive to train, but it's also incredibly expensive to serve every time someone prompts it.
Every single query costs money.
Right. So if global businesses and everyday consumers don't end up paying for premium, recurring subscriptions at a scale that justifies $1 trillion of investment over a 3-year window,
you could see a massive crash.
A violent contraction in the U.S. private sector's willingness to fund this frontier tech. Yeah.
And that potential contraction is why that $9.3 billion figure from China shouldn't just be dismissed.
Not all.
Because Chinese commercial leaders are operating under a completely different monetization paradigm, right? Look at Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent.
They don't have the global consumer reach of ChatGPT.
But their domestic cloud revenues are surging. I mean, Baidu's AI cloud revenue was up 79% year over year in the first quarter of 2026.
And Tencent saw its business services growth accelerate to 22%, driven almost entirely by AI enterprise demand. They are generating real sustainable revenue right now.
They're monetizing differently because their environment is different. They've mastered embedding AI into existing super apps.
Which is key.
Yeah, we're talking about deep integration into massive e-commerce platforms, telecom networks, smart devices that hundreds of millions of people already use every day.
Right. They don't need to invent a brand new standalone subscription service.
Exactly. They don't have to convince a massive export market to buy a new product to justify their costs. They are making AI functional and invisible within their own domestic ecosystem.
And highly profitable.
Yeah.
Which lowers their dependence on the direct consumer subscriptions that U.S. firms are betting everything on.
So while the absolute dollar amount is vastly different, the Chinese ecosystem isn't really capital starved in the areas that matter for domestic integration.
Right. But capital is only one input.
True.
A generative AI model is ultimately the product of the human minds that architect it, right?
Yeah.
The people who design the training, runs, and curate the data. The money is useless without the intellectual capital to direct it.
Which brings us to the demographic realities in the report, the global brainpower flow. And honestly, this might be the most fascinating dynamic in the entire document.
It's incredibly revealing.
We're talking about a talent tug of war. The report specifically looks at the world's absolute elite AI researchers, the top-tier scientists publishing the most cited foundational papers. And it turns out China is arguably the most efficient training mechanism for these minds in the world.
Their educational output is staggering.
A whopping 47% of the world's elite AI researchers were educated and trained in China. Almost half of the global top-tier talent pool originates from one nation's educational system.
Yes, but here is the paradox.
Right.
China only manages to retain 11% of its own top talent.
That outbound migration is just massive.
It is, because the U.S. currently possesses the world's strongest capture mechanism for elite intellect. According to the 2026 data, U.S. institutions and corporations employ 59% of all elite AI researchers globally.
Wow.
So this formidable U.S. lead is built largely on imported brilliance. Just to put a fine point on it, in 2024, temporary visa holders earned 61% of all U.S. doctorates in computer and information sciences.
61%. I mean, think about that. It's like China is running the world's most rigorous AI bootcamp, churning out these absolute prodigies in math and computer science.
And the U.S. is the major league franchise.
Exactly. Drafting all their best players right out from under them the second they turn pro.
It's a profound structural dynamic. The U.S. strategy of dominating frontier AI is inextricably linked to and entirely dependent upon its immigration policy.
Which is a huge strength.
Yes, the ability to aggregate the absolute best minds, give them unmatched compute, and integrate them into a dynamic ecosystem regardless of where they were born. But a strength built on external inputs is inherently a massive vulnerability.
Okay, I want to push back on that vulnerability aspect for a second.
Okay.
Let's look at the resources the United States has. We just talked about the government spending $39 billion on the Cheap PS Act to bring semiconductor manufacturing home. So, if the political winds shift, if the U.S. starts closing its doors to immigration, making H-1B visas harder to get, or whatever, why couldn't the U.S. just redirect massive funding into domestic STEM scholarships?
It's not that simple.
But why couldn't we just dump billions into MIT, Stanford, state universities, and just train up our own domestic pipeline of researchers? Would American leadership really erode, or would it just take a couple of years to transition?
The issue is the temporal gap. You cannot substitute 61% of a nation's elite PhD pipeline overnight, regardless of the money you throw at it.
Because education takes time.
Right. Reforming a domestic education system, cultivating math excellence from primary school up through doctoral programs, that takes a minimum of 20 years to yield a mature, elite researcher capable of architecting a frontier AI model.
That's a long wait.
The U.S. lead depends on the immediate, continuous influx of talent today. If that pipeline is choked off by restrictive visas, the foundational bedrock of American AI dominance begins to crack immediately, long before domestic students can be trained to replace them.
That generational lag is terrifying when you're in a race moving at the speed of months, not decades.
Absolutely. And China isn't just sitting passively watching the brain drain happen.
No, they clearly see the leak in their boat. The report details China's 2018 action plan from their Ministry of Education, which was designed to overhaul university AI curricula and aggressively scale talent training by 2030.
They have a national goal for 2035 to lead globally in attracting top talent.
Yeah, offering fiscal subsidies, tax support, state-funded lab resources. They are trying hard to build a domestic pipeline that actually stays domestic.
Conversely, the U.S. is attempting to address its domestic shortfall, but it really highlights that delay we just discussed. In April 2025, there was an executive order to advance AI education for American youth.
Focusing on baseline literacy and teacher training, right?
Right. Vital steps for the long term.
Hmm.
But let's be realistic. Educational reform at the grade school level does not produce the senior engineers you need to train a trillion-parameter model next year.
Yeah, that math just doesn't work out.
So in the near and medium term, the U.S. remains entirely reliant on the global talent pool, which is predominantly the Chinese talent pool.
It's a wild geopolitical reality. The very minds driving the technological dominance of the U.S. were fundamentally trained by its primary strategic rival.
It really is.
But let's move down the stack, because even the most brilliant engineers in the world, whether they're in California or Shenzhen, they can't build a frontier AI model out of thin air. They need tools.
They need compute.
Right. The raw industrial material of the digital age.
Compute is the hard currency of the AI race. We're moving away from abstract algorithms here and into massive physical infrastructure.
Semiconductors, server farms, power grids.
Exactly. And here is where the numbers get incredibly stark again. In late 2025, analysts estimated U.S. firms controlled nearly 75% of the world's total AI compute power.
Wow. 75%.
And China, despite its massive industrial base, controlled only about 15%.
That is a massive gap.
And when you look at high-performance computing, the true giants of the industry, U.S. dominance is even more pronounced. In June 2025, all three of the world's publicly listed exascale systems were sitting securely within U.S. Department of Energy labs.
Okay, exascale. Let's break that down for the listener because it sounds like a term from a sci-fi movie. What does exascale actually mean in raw capability?
An exascale system is a supercomputer capable of performing 1 quintillion calculations per second.
A quintillion.
Right, that's a 1 followed by 18 zeros. To visualize that, if every single human being on Earth completed 1 calculation per second, it would take the global population over 4 years to do what an exascale computer does in a single second.
That's just unfathomable.
And in the context of AI, this scale of compute is the holy grail. Training a frontier model requires processing just unbelievable amounts of text, image, and video data, constantly adjusting trillions of parameters to minimize error.
Simulating language, logic, real-world physics.
Without systems approaching this scale, iterating on advanced AI architectures becomes impossibly slow and prohibitively expensive.
Which explains exactly why the U.S. has aggressively weaponized this specific advantage. They know the bottleneck.
They absolutely do.
Without the most advanced chips, you can't train frontier models. So the U.S. strategy relies heavily on these strict export controls. The BIS, the Bureau of Industry and Security, issued these increasingly draconian rules between 2022 and 2025.
An iterative blockade.
But how do these controls actually work in practice? We aren't talking about customs agents inspecting every cargo ship leaving a port, right?
No, the enforcement is logistical and technological. It's focused on the absolute choke points of the supply chain. The U.S. doesn't just ban the sale of the finished chips.
They ban the machines that make them.
Yes, they restrict the sale of the immensely complex lithography machines needed to manufacture the chips. They restrict the software tools used to design the chip architectures. And for chips already manufactured, they rely on end-use restrictions and even software locks embedded in the hardware itself.
Software locks.
Yeah. The chip can prevent itself from functioning if it detects it's operating in a restricted geographic region or talking to an unauthorized server cluster. The goal is to comprehensively cut China off from the hardware and the equipment needed to make the hardware.
And the U.S. is combining this embargo with massive domestic stimulus. Like we mentioned, the CHES Act $39 billion to rebuild domestic semiconductor manufacturing.
Handing out grants to Intel, TSMC.
Right, building fabs in Arizona and Ohio. So the strategy is hoard the advanced chips, subsidize domestic production, and block those capabilities from going abroad.
But China obviously isn't just surrendering.
Right. How are they responding to an embargo like this?
They've responded with a massive, state-directed, industrial-scale infrastructure build-out. They're attempting to brute force their way through the compute deficit.
Just building out.
Yeah. By July 2025, the Chinese government authorized over 7,000 new data centers across the country as part of the Eastern Data Western Computing strategy.
Building them in the energy-rich Western provinces to process data from the East.
Exactly.
But wait, here's a massive caveat from the report. Reuters did an investigation and found that a significant portion of those 7,000 newly built data centers were running at incredibly low capacity.
Some at only 20 to 30% utilization.
Yeah, so you have these massive facilities that are basically empty. Why pour billions into concrete if you can't fill the rooms?
This brings us to a concept that's absolutely vital. Effective compute. Having a massive concrete building with reinforced floors and some basic servers does not mean you have a supercomputer capable of training a frontier AI model.
It's not just about the building.
Right. To use an analogy,
Yeah.
having 10,000 highly advanced raw AI chips is like having 10,000 Ferrari engines sitting on pallets in a warehouse.
Powerful but useless.
Exactly. Unless you have the transmission systems to link them together, the steering mechanisms to guide their processing power, and the massive liquid radiators required to keep them from melting, you aren't going anywhere.
So effective compute requires integration.
It requires the absolute most advanced AI accelerators, which the U.S. is blocking. It requires highly mature software ecosystems, like NVIDIA's CDA platform, and it requires immense uninterrupted power and specialized cooling.
So China has a data center boom, but a severe deficit in effective compute integration.
Probably, yes.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because when you squeeze a balloon, the air doesn't disappear. It violently moves somewhere else.
Right.
The U.S. embargoes are imposing massive friction, but they forced China into a strategy of rapid, compulsory domestic substitution, and they are making undeniable gains.
In 2025, China's integrated circuit output, their domestic chip production, increased by 10.9%.
And they led the world in semiconductor equipment investment. They're buying up older, unrestricted machines and just pushing them to their absolute physical limits.
And crucially, the Chinese state is actively forcing its internal market to adopt this domestic tech.
The state mandate.
Yeah, the report highlights that massive project in Qinghai, spearheaded by China Unicom. It's a huge data center complex built utilizing only domestically designed and manufactured AI chips.
Trying to prove they can scale without American hardware.
Exactly. And by late 2025, the government required the use of domestic AI chips in all state-funded data centers. They're providing a guaranteed market for their domestic chip makers, letting them iterate and improve with state backing.
So looking at the long-term trajectory, are the U.S. export controls actually succeeding in holding China back? Or are they inadvertently forcing China to build a completely self-sufficient, parallel supply chain that will eventually rival the U.S. entirely?
It's arguably the central debate in tech policy right now.
Yeah.
In the short term, yes, the controls are highly effective. They make it much harder and more expensive for Chinese researchers to train frontier models.
But long-term?
Long-term, these sanctions act as a brutal evolutionary pressure. By denying China access to NVIDIA chips, the U.S. has guaranteed Beijing will pour limitless resources into creating a Chinese equivalent.
Yeah.
They're essentially inoculating China against future sanctions by forcing absolute strategic autonomy.
Wow. That's a huge backfire risk.
And we also have to be extremely cautious with those public supercomputing metrics we discussed earlier.
Oh, right. Because they went dark.
Exactly. The report explicitly notes that lists like the TOP 500 likely underrepresent China's operational capabilities because the government just ordered institutions to stop disclosing specifications of their newest systems.
They intentionally hid their progress.
Analytical caution is strictly required. The U.S. has a verifiable lead, but China's true hardware position is likely much stronger than public rankings suggest.
Okay, let's summarize the state of the board. The U.S. has deep private capital, imported global talent, and cutting-edge compute. China possesses unmatched manufacturing, a massive domestic market, and the absolute state will to build parallel systems. But how are these two governments actually steering these massive ships?
Because the strategic playbooks are fundamentally opposed.
Completely.
They operate on entirely different temporal horizons and ideological foundations.
Let's look at the U.S. first. In July 2025, the White House released America's AI Action Plan. The language shifted heavily from cautious safety rhetoric toward dominance through speed, scale, and infrastructure.
But relying almost entirely on the private sector.
Right. The federal government just plays a supporting regulatory role, handing out grants, adjusting export controls, but the timeline they operate on is remarkably short.
Tightly bound to domestic politics. We're talking 1 to 3 year increments. Policy continuity is constantly threatened by election cycles, congressional budgets, and quarterly earnings reports of tech giants.
To illustrate the mismatch, the federal funding request for AI R&D for fiscal year 2025 was about $3.3 billion.
Which is a tiny fraction of what a company like Microsoft spends on infrastructure in a single quarter.
Contrast that fragmented, short-term approach with China. Their foundational document, the New Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan, was published back in 2017.
The goal was set nearly a decade ago. Become the primary global innovation center by 2030.
They don't operate on election cycles. They operate on multi-decade horizons. In 2024 and 2025, they expanded this into the AI Plus initiative, mandating AI integration into every traditional sector of their economy.
And backing it with massive centralized funding, like the 1 trillion RMB National Venture Capital Guidance Fund launched in late 2025.
This temporal difference is defining. China has a much higher institutional tolerance for long builds and near-term inefficiency.
Like those empty data centers.
Right. In the US, building billions of dollars of infrastructure that sits 80% empty is a catastrophic failure. The CEO gets fired.
But in the Chinese state-guided model, it's viewed as deliberately pre-positioning infrastructure for demand they anticipate a decade from now.
I have to challenge this dynamic, though, because it feels like the ultimate stress test of the free market against a planned economy.
It really is.
Can a fragmented, quarterly-driven American system where strategy changes every 4 years truly compete with top-down, multi-decade industrial mobilization, or are the U.S. tech giants basically acting as sovereign states at this point?
It's a profound observation. The U.S. government is essentially relying heavily on a handful of megacorporations to act as the vanguard of its national security.
Which is risky.
The inherent risk is strategic misalignment. What is optimal for a tech giant's quarterly profit margin is not necessarily identical to the long-term national security needs of the U.S. government.
Right.
Whereas China's system forcibly aligns industrial policy, municipal governments, telecom operators, and corporate national champions around specific deployment goals.
Which perfectly sets up the next phase detailed in the report. Because a brilliant strategy is just a PDF until it hits the real world.
Exactly. Diffusion.
The true measure of success is who puts that digital intelligence into the hands of factory workers, doctors, and critically soldiers.
This is where the nature of the competition radically changes.
Because it's about giving that digital brain a body in the physical economy. The report says the U.S. maintains a strong lead in complex data environments like healthcare diagnostics and financial modeling.
Which makes sense given U.S. cloud dominance.
But in the physical world, China dominates the metrics. They lead globally in AI publication volume, patent grants, and industrial robot installations.
They excel at taking AI out of the digital realm and embedding it into manufacturing and supply chains.
Baidu aggressively expanding robotaxis in major cities, treating physical AI as a real scalable business. But we have to address the most sensitive area of diffusion covered in the source material.
The military.
Yes, the military. And, before we get into the military stuff, we really need to set a baseline here for you listening. We are strictly, neutrally reporting the findings of this 2026 research report.
Important context.
We're not taking a geopolitical side, nor endorsing the ethics of either defense establishment. We're strictly examining how both nations are attempting to operationalize this tech for defense.
Right. When we look at military diffusion, we see two vastly different approaches for battlefield superiority. The U.S. military strategy is focused on scalable, autonomous systems to counter adversary mass.
Like the Replicator initiative in 2023.
Yes, aiming to field thousands of autonomous systems across air, land, and sea. And the 2026 AI strategy for the Department of War explicitly set the goal of absolute military AI dominance.
But the report highlights a massive structural roadblock for the U.S., and it's not lack of tech, it's absorption.
The absorption bottleneck is severe. The U.S. defense establishment has incredible access to advanced chips and talent. The challenge is bureaucracy.
Procurement.
Exactly. It takes years to maneuver iterative software like AI through rigid, legally complex defense acquisition processes. Integrating constantly updating algorithms into legacy joint force operations is a monumental hurdle.
Whereas China's approach is driven by military-civil fusion, which operates on entirely different rules.
Intentionally interwoven with their civilian industrial base. A 2026 RAND review found the PLA intends to embed advanced AI across their entire operational kill chain.
Let's define kill chain quickly. It refers to the sequential process of an attack, identifying a target, dispatching forces, and destroying it. The goal of AI here is to compress that timeline from minutes down to milliseconds.
Processing radar, satellite, and drone data instantly to make engagement decisions faster than humanly possible.
And because of military-civil fusion, the Chinese state can instantly mobilize purely civilian firms, telecom operators, commercial drone manufacturers, national surveillance, and repurpose their tech for military utility during a crisis.
It is important to note that China's structural advantage in rapidly deploying AI for mass surveillance comes at a massive cost to civil liberties.
Which is a trade-off the Chinese state is willing to make.
Meanwhile, the U.S. military is constrained by litigation, constitutional rules, and political pushback over things like facial recognition.
It's a completely different societal baseline. But the report notes something fascinating. Pillay authors are surprisingly realistic about their own flaws. They cite severe data scarcity, weak underlying algorithms, and cyber vulnerabilities.
They are very clear-eyed about their challenges. But there is a specific, alarming dual-use issue in the report we have to discuss.
The dilemma of open weight models.
Yes.
This was the most jarring detail. A Reuters investigation from late 2024 detailed how Chinese researchers, linked to PLA institutions, took Meta's Llama model, a highly advanced American open source model, and built a customized, military-focused AI called ChatBit directly on top of it.
Optimized for military intelligence gathering. But to understand the gravity, we have to distinguish open source and open weight. Releasing an open weight model means releasing the finished, fully trained digital brain.
Anyone can download it.
Yes. Developers worldwide can build upon it without bearing the millions of dollars in compute costs required to train it from scratch.
So Meta spent millions of dollars and massive compute power to train this model, release the weights for academic collaboration, and researchers affiliated with a strategic adversary just downloaded it, tweaked it, and weaponized it for their own military. For free.
It perfectly illustrates the profound geopolitical dilemma of open source AI. Is releasing advanced model weights openly a necessary driver of global innovation? Or is it a direct leakage channel for military competitors?
The U.S. commercial tech community strongly believes open source drives the ecosystem forward.
But national security planners look at an incident like ChatBit and see an adversary actively weaponizing American-funded research.
So stepping back, we have this escalating dynamic. The U.S. is hoarding advanced chips, relying on a few corporate giants, struggling with military bureaucracy. China is building thousands of empty data centers to force domestic innovation, hoovering up open-source American research, and deeply fusing civilian tech with its military.
The entire structural foundation of the global technological system is under immense strain.
We're rapidly entering the phase the report calls the Great Bifurcation.
The rules of the road are diverging sharply.
In the U.S., governance is trending toward a lighter, market-driven touch. The current administration moved from safe, secure, trustworthy in 2023 toward a competitiveness-first doctrine, removing barriers, preempting state-level regulations.
China, conversely, is methodically building an incredibly dense, highly rigid administrative framework.
Comprehensive rules governing algorithms, deepfakes, and commercial generative AI, like the September 2025 mandatory content labeling rules.
And we really need to caution against the assumption that China is simply less regulated than the U.S.
Right, you mentioned this in the source notes. It's a dangerous misconception to think China is a Wild West for AI.
They are actually regulated differently. The Chinese framework is deeply focused on information control, provenance of training data, and direct state supervision. By March 2025, over 300 generative AI products had to complete rigorous state security assessments before operating.
It's a highly managed system.
Meticulously designed to register, trace, and politically steer that innovation.
And as these two giants codify vastly different rulebooks, international alliances are visibly fraying. Look at the proposed MTCH Act in the U.S. in May 2026. The U.S. aggressively pressured Japan and the Netherlands to perfectly mirror U.S. export controls on semiconductor equipment.
And the Dutch government basically pushed back to protect their crown jewel, ASML, causing real political friction.
You can't continually force sovereign nations to sacrifice their own economic interests indefinitely.
And meanwhile, China is actively utilizing selective economic coercion. In May 2026, they only partially agreed to address severe U.S. concerns over rare earth supply shortages.
A calculated reminder that while the U.S. controls chip designs, China controls the raw physical materials needed to build them.
Exactly.
So bringing this back to the listener, based on this 2026 report, are we headed for a complete Cold War-style decoupling? Does the global internet just split in two?
The report is nuanced on this. It avoids apocalyptic predictions. It suggests a complex, friction-heavy managed duopoly or partial bifurcation.
Meaning?
The U.S. will likely remain dominant in frontier model training, cloud infrastructure, and aggregating elite scientific talent. China will remain an absolute powerhouse in physical diffusion, industrial robotics, domestic substitution, and mid-tier applications.
So a future of overlapping, heavily contested, distinct technological ecosystems. If you're a global business, the era of a single global tech standard is over.
You'll be forced to choose a side or spend massive capital bridging two separate tech stacks.
One stack running on U.S. frontier cloud services and another running on Chinese deployment hardware.
The precise operational reality moving forward. The report recommends third countries avoid single-stack dependence, diversify cloud providers, and focus on practical AI capacity rather than bankrupting themselves trying to compete in the frontier race.
Let's synthesize this incredibly deep dive. The core realization for me is there's no clean victory available here. The narrative of unassailable American dominance is outdated. The U.S. holds the top of the stack, but China dominates the middle and bottom.
It's a highly volatile dynamic equilibrium. And the report offers urgent policy recommendations for both nations. For the U.S., the absolute imperative is protecting its immigration pipeline.
Because leadership structurally depends on capturing global talent.
Yes, and the U.S. must treat its aging energy grid as critical national AI policy. You cannot power frontier models without a massive expansion of baseline electricity generation.
And for China,
China must urgently address its data center overbuild, shifting focus to utilization and software ecosystem maturity.
Right.
Crucially, they must protect open academic exchange to fix their systemic inability to retain elite scientific minds.
it's an incredibly fragile balance. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering thought built on a concept from the end of the report: the AI security dilemma.
Right.
It made me think deeply about the ultimate stakes here. The true existential danger of this contest might not be that one side eventually wins. The ultimate danger might be the psychological dynamic of the race itself.
Geopolitical acceleration without a functional brake pedal.
Exactly. Both superpowers are rushing at breakneck speed to integrate highly complex, largely opaque AI models into critical national systems. Supply chain logistics, national power grids, and, terrifyingly, nuclear command and early warning networks.
Driven by the desperate need to outpace the other side's decision cycle.
But we know these models hallucinate. They make unpredictable errors. So as this autonomous race accelerates, compressing the time for human judgment from minutes to milliseconds, what happens when an algorithm tasked with making a split-second strategic decision simply hallucinates a threat?
A profoundly unsettling question.
Is the real danger the military capability of the other country? Or is the true existential threat the reckless speed at which both nations are willingly handing the geopolitical steering wheel over to systems they don't fully understand?
It's something we absolutely have to consider as this scales.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you hear about global technology, look beyond the headlines, and we will see you next time.